rarely notice power when it's working. There's no moment where it announces itself. No warning. No confrontation. If it had to demand your attention, it would already be failing. Real power operates quietly. It doesn't push you. It positions you. It decides what feels normal long before you're aware a decision was made. It shapes what options appear reasonable, what questions feel worth asking, what resistance feels unnecessary. By the time you sense something is wrong, you've already adapted. That's the part most people miss. They imagine control as force, raised voices, clear threats, visible authority. But the systems that last don't rely on pressure. They rely on alignment. They arrange incentives so compliance feels voluntary. They delay consequences until patterns are established. They reward behavior subtly, inconsistently, just enough to keep you guessing. And when you hesitate, when you feel uncertain or drained or oddly passive, you don't blame the system. You blame yourself. You assume you're tired, overthinking, not motivated enough, not strong enough. That assumption is the final mechanism, because power that can convince you it isn't there no longer needs to defend itself. You won't fight what you can't name. You won't resist what feels natural. You won't question what appears neutral. And so the most effective control doesn't dominate you. It disappears. It becomes the background noise of your decisions, the unspoken rules of your environment, the invisible hand guiding what feels possible and what feels pointless. Most people live their entire lives inside this structure without ever seeing it clearly, not because they're unintelligent, but because the system was designed that way. And once you begin to recognize it, something changes. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly, just like power itself. Most people are taught the wrong version of power. They're shown a theatrical model, a loud one, a visible one. Power, in this version, looks like authority figures, wealth on display, dominance in conversation, control exercised openly. It's the person who speaks last, the person who interrupts, the person who can punish you immediately. This image is comforting because it makes power easy to locate. If power is loud, you know where it is. If power is obvious, you know when you're facing it. If power is aggressive, you know when to defend yourself. But that image is incomplete. And more importantly, it's useful. Because when people are trained to look for power in the wrong places, they stop noticing it where it actually operates. True power avoids spectacle. It avoids emotional displays. It avoids confrontation unless confrontation is unavoidable. Force creates resistance. Visibility invites challenge. Dominance provokes counter-dominance. So systems that intend to last learn to do something else. They let you believe you're free. They allow choice, but only within boundaries that were set long before you arrived. They present multiple paths that all lead to the same outcome. They frame constraints as preferences. You aren't told what to think. You're taught what makes sense to think. You aren't ordered to comply. You're rewarded for behaving correctly and ignored when you don't. Over time, the reward structure becomes internal. You start self-correcting, self-editing, self-limiting, and because no one is visibly forcing you, you interpret this as maturity, as responsibility, as realism. That's the trap. The most stable form of control is the one that convinces you it doesn't exist. It doesn't need to suppress rebellion. It simply makes rebellion feel impractical, embarrassing, or pointless. This is why people often mock overt authority while remaining loyal to invisible systems. They distrust politicians but obey algorithms. They question institutions but internalize incentives. They resent control while participating in it daily. Because what feels abstract doesn't trigger the same instinct to resist. And when power operates at the level of environment instead of command, it doesn't have to win arguments. It just has to shape outcomes. By the time you notice the pattern, you're already living inside it. And the most unsettling realization isn't that power exists everywhere. It's that most of it works without anyone actively wielding it. In the next segment, we'll go deeper into how these systems train behavior slowly, how they normalize submission without ever demanding it, and why awareness alone isn't enough to escape them. Because seeing the mechanism is only the first step. Understanding how it rewires you is something else entirely. Control becomes most effective when it no longer needs supervision. Once behavior is shaped consistently enough, enforcement becomes redundant. The system doesn't have to watch you closely because you've already learned how to watch yourself. This is where most people misunderstand how compliance actually works. They imagine obedience as something imposed from the outside, orders given, rules enforced, punishment applied when boundaries are crossed. But the most efficient systems don't rely on external pressure. They rely on internal regulation. You begin to anticipate consequences before they arrive. You adjust your behavior before anyone reacts. You silence yourself before conflict even forms. At first, this feels like intelligence, awareness, emotional maturity. You learn what's rewarded. You learn what's ignored. You learn what quietly costs you time, energy, or social standing. And slowly, without noticing the transition, you stop testing the boundaries. Not because you were told to stop, but because the effort no longer feels worth it. This is how control migrates inward. Psychologically, this process is subtle but profound. The brain is exceptionally good at pattern recognition. When it notices that certain behaviors lead to friction, confusion, exclusion, delay, it begins to avoid those behaviors automatically. No one needs to threaten you. No one needs to explain the rule. Your nervous system does the work. You start filtering your thoughts before they become words. You rehearse conversations that never happen. You feel a small internal resistance when an idea forms, an almost physical sense that speaking it would be inconvenient. That sensation is not intuition, it's conditioning. And once this internal filter is installed, the system becomes remarkably efficient. People enforce norms on themselves and on each other. They correct deviations socially, casually, without malice. They discourage questioning not through argument, but through tone, timing, and implication. A raised eyebrow, a pause, a joke that reframes dissent as naivete. Nothing dramatic occurs, no moment of collapse, just a gradual narrowing of what feels acceptable to express. Over time, the range of possible behavior shrinks, not because the system became stricter, but because people became more cautious. This is why control rarely feels like oppression while it's happening. Oppression is obvious. Oppression generates solidarity and resistance. Oppression invites confrontation. Internalized control does the opposite. It feels like order, like common sense, like professionalism, like social intelligence. And because it masquerades as virtue, it goes unchallenged. People begin defending the very constraints that limit them. They justify rules they didn't design. They explain systems they don't benefit from. They repeat logic that keeps them contained, because rejecting it would mean confronting uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. It's easier to believe the system is neutral than to accept that it's shaping you quietly. It's easier to call adaptation realism than to admit that the environment has trained you. This is the moment where awareness becomes dangerous, not to the system, but to the individual. Because once you recognize that your behavior has been shaped, you're faced with a question most people avoid. If no one explicitly told you to stop, why did you? And more importantly, who benefited when you did? In the next segment, we'll explore why recognizing these patterns doesn't automatically free you, why intelligence alone isn't protection, and why the illusion of awareness often becomes another layer of control. Because the system doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes how you interpret your own thoughts. At this point, most people assume awareness is enough. They believe that once you can name the mechanism, it loses its power. That insight creates distance. That intelligence creates protection. It doesn't. In many cases, awareness becomes the system's most elegant refinement, because understanding how control works doesn't remove you from the environment where it operates. You still live inside the same structures. You still depend on the same incentives. You still navigate the same social and economic gravity. Knowing you're inside a system doesn't place you outside it. It simply gives you a new story to tell yourself about why you're still complying. People begin to confuse recognition with resistance. They notice the pattern, name it, analyze it, and then continue behaving exactly as before. The behavior doesn't change, but the discomfort does. Awareness provides psychological relief without requiring action. You tell yourself you see it clearly now, that you're not fooled, that you're choosing pragmatism, not submission. That story is comforting. It preserves identity. It protects ego. It avoids risk. And because the system never demanded belief, only participation, it remains perfectly satisfied. This is why intelligence is not a defense against control. In some cases, it's an accelerant. Highly analytical people are especially vulnerable to this illusion. They can articulate the problem in precise language while remaining fully embedded in its effects. They can critique structures fluently while adjusting their behavior to survive within them. They mistake explanation for exit. But the system doesn't require ignorance to function. It only requires predictability. As long as your behavior remains consistent, legible, and aligned with existing incentives, your internal understanding is irrelevant. The structure doesn't care what you believe. It cares what you do. And this is where the illusion becomes complete. You begin to experience a strange split. On one level, you recognize that something is shaping you. On another, you continue to adapt because the costs of not adapting feel immediate and real. So you compromise, not once, but repeatedly. Each compromise feels minor, justified, temporary. You tell yourself you'll push back later, when the timing is better, when you're more secure, when the risk is lower. But the environment is designed so that moment never quite arrives, because the longer you adapt, the more adaptation becomes your baseline. Eventually, the version of yourself that might have resisted becomes hypothetical, a thought experiment, a memory, not because it was destroyed, but because it was never reinforced. This is how control persists without cruelty. It doesn't break you. It doesn't silence you. It simply waits while you reorganize yourself around it. And by the time you realize that awareness hasn't freed you, the question shifts. It's no longer, do I see the system? It becomes something quieter, more unsettling. What would it actually cost me to stop cooperating? That's the question most people never answer. In the next segment, we'll explore why that cost feels so high, why uncertainty triggers compliance more effectively than fear, and how environments are engineered to make non-participation feel like self-destruction rather than choice. Because the most powerful systems don't threaten you. They convince you that stepping outside them would be worse. At some point, the question stops being theoretical. It's no longer about whether control exists, or how it works, or whether you're aware of it. The question becomes personal. What would it actually cost you to stop cooperating? Not in dramatic terms, not as a grand rebellion, but in small, ordinary ways. What would happen if you spoke when you normally stay silent? If you delayed instead of rushing to comply? If you refused to optimize yourself around expectations you never agreed to? The system doesn't answer these questions directly. It lets your imagination do the work. You picture inconvenience, loss of status, misunderstanding, exclusion, not catastrophe, just friction. And friction is enough. Human psychology is wired to avoid uncertainty more than discomfort. Predictable dissatisfaction feels safer than unpredictable outcomes. Known limitations feel preferable to undefined risk. This is why environments of control don't need to threaten you. They simply make alternatives feel vague, unstable, and isolating. The moment you imagine stepping outside the structure, you also imagine standing alone, without context, without reassurance, without a script. And that absence is what stops most people. Belonging is one of the strongest psychological anchors there is. Systems understand this. They don't just regulate behavior, they regulate identity. They offer you a place, a role, a narrative that explains who you are and where you fit. To step away from that isn't just to lose convenience, it's to lose coherence. You don't just ask, "What would I do instead?" You ask, "Who would I be without this?" That question has no immediate answer, and so most people retreat from it before it fully forms. They return to the familiar routines, the subtle compromises, the quiet self-editing. Not because they've been defeated, but because the alternative feels like standing in open space with no orientation. This is how compliance becomes self-preservation. The system doesn't present itself as a jailer. It presents itself as a shelter. Even when the shelter limits your movement, narrows your thinking, and slowly erodes your sense of agency, it still feels safer than exposure. And so cooperation continues, not out of belief, but out of caution. People stay not because they agree, but because leaving feels like disappearance. What's rarely acknowledged is that this fear isn't irrational. Uncertainty is destabilizing. Stepping outside structure does create risk. The illusion is not that the cost exists. The illusion is that the cost only exists outside the system. Because the price of constant adaptation is paid quietly, over time, in energy, in self-trust, in the gradual narrowing of what you believe yourself capable of. That cost is harder to measure. There's no single moment where you can point and say, "This is where it happened." There's only a slow realization that you've become very good at surviving, and less certain about what you're surviving for. There is a moment, rare, quiet, and often uncomfortable, when the struggle to escape gives way to something else. Not surrender, not rebellion, clarity. It happens when you stop asking how to break free and start noticing how you're being shaped in real time. Not abstractly, not philosophically, but moment by moment, inside your own reactions. You notice the hesitation before you speak, the tightening in your chest when an idea feels risky, the impulse to soften your words before anyone has responded. These reactions aren't moral failures. They aren't signs of weakness. They're data. They tell you where pressure exists, where expectations are operating silently, where the environment is doing work on your behalf. Most people never look here. They stay focused on outcomes, success, stability, approval, without examining the subtle, internal adjustments required to maintain them. But once you begin to observe yourself honestly, something shifts. You stop identifying entirely with your behavior. You begin to see it as adaptive. And adaptation, once seen clearly, is no longer invisible. This is not freedom in the dramatic sense. It doesn't come with a feeling of triumph or certainty. It comes with distance. You start noticing that many of your decisions aren't expressions of desire, but responses to pressure. You recognize how often you move toward what feels acceptable rather than what feels true. How frequently you choose predictability over alignment. This realization doesn't immediately change your life, but it changes how you inhabit it. You become less surprised by your own compromises, less harsh toward yourself for making them, and less convinced that they are permanent. The system thrives on unconscious participation. It weakens when participation becomes observed. Not because observation dismantles the structure, but because it restores agency at the level where agency actually exists, inside perception. You may still comply. You may still adapt. You may still choose safety over uncertainty. But now you're aware of the trade being made. And awareness, when sustained, has a quiet, cumulative effect. It slows the automatic response. It creates space between stimulus and adjustment. It allows choice to re-enter moments where it had quietly disappeared. This is why systems are comfortable with surface-level critique, but uneasy with sustained self-observation. Analysis can be absorbed, commentary can be ignored, but attention, directed inward, consistently, is harder to manage, because it doesn't attack the structure, it changes the relationship to it, and that change doesn't announce itself either. It shows up as hesitation, where there was once reflex, as silence, where there was once compliance, as curiosity, where there was once assumption. Nothing dramatic happens. No identity collapses. No rules are broken. But something subtle begins to reorient. You stop asking how the system controls people. You start noticing how it moves through you. And once you see that clearly, you're no longer entirely inside it in the same way you were before. You're still present, still navigating, still embedded, but you're no longer invisible to yourself. And in environments built on quiet adaptation, that alone is not nothing. In the closing reflection, we'll return to the idea we began with. Not to resolve it, but to leave it where it belongs, unsettled. Because power that disappears into the background only works as long as it remains unnoticed. And noticing, even without action, is never neutral. Power doesn't end where we expect it to. It doesn't collapse when it's exposed. It doesn't retreat when it's understood. It simply adjusts to the level of attention it receives. That's why the most effective systems don't rely on belief or loyalty. They don't require agreement. They don't even require ignorance. They only require participation. And participation is easiest to maintain when it feels ordinary, when it blends into routine, when it hides inside responsibility, professionalism, realism, and survival. Most people aren't controlled because they're deceived. They're controlled because the environment makes certain choices feel easier than others, because adaptation feels safer than uncertainty, because the cost of stepping out is immediate, while the cost of staying in is diffuse and slow. So power remains unchallenged, not through force, but through familiarity. This is why it rarely announces itself. The moment it becomes visible, it invites reaction. The moment it becomes loud, it creates opposition. The moment it demands obedience, it risks refusal. But when it dissolves into the background of daily life, it no longer needs to defend itself. It becomes the water you move through, the gravity you adjust to, the rules you follow without remembering when you learned them. And the question, in the end, is not whether you can escape these systems. That question assumes a clean exit, a clear outside, a moment where everything changes. For most people, that moment never comes. The more relevant question is quieter. How much of your behavior is response, and how much is choice? How often do you adapt before you decide? How often do you comply without being asked? How often do you mistake survival for alignment? These questions don't demand answers. They demand attention. Because power that operates silently only remains effective as long as it remains unseen. And once you begin to notice it, not abstractly, not politically, but personally, something subtle begins to change. Not rebellion, not certainty, orientation. You start recognizing pressure where you once felt instinct. You start noticing boundaries where you once felt comfort. You begin to feel the shape of the environment instead of mistaking it for reality itself. And that awareness doesn't free you, but it does make you harder to move without your consent. Power rarely announces itself. That's why it works, and why noticing it, even quietly, matters more than most people realize.